Good morning. So I'm Arnie Altinier, and I discovered web accessibility when I had health problems, and I tried to use the internet, and one day I couldn't use my right hand, and I didn't understand why it didn't work. So I just checked the code, but I wasn't a coder at the time. I was studying Chinese, so that's completely different. And I just discovered some website works and other don't, and that's a really big problem for people when they have disability for permanent time. So since 2007, I work on the accessibility, digital accessibility, not only web, but now we should talk about digital. And what I discovered is we always focus on technical problems, but web accessibility and digital accessibility is not a technical problem for real. So we're going to see that accessibility should be considered as a process in your organization, and the key issue is the organization. How do you take the accessibility into account in your organization? And the problem is often human, not technical. Then we'll see the slightest difference between compliance and accessibility and how it's important and why. And I tried to give you some tips about how to take accessibility concretely into account in your organization based on United Nations definition of reasonable accommodation. So accessibility as a process. We can talk about accessibility as a process like in the ISO 9001 quality method. It's a standard that explains everything in your company or organization. It works in a foundation tour or a non-profit. Should be considered as a process. It's not a step. We saw with the previous speaker that it's not in one point in the project, but it's all along the process. And at the beginning, everybody wanted to outsource accessibility. So we just discovered in our company, we had problem. We want to have a logo or something that say we're good in accessibility. So we pay experts, and we have a perfect website, for example, or perfect product, free software. And then maybe in 2 weeks, it's not accessible anymore. Why? Because they outsourced the question of accessibility. And the accessibility can't be outsourced. We really want to take it into account for the long run. So the key problem is who is accountable for accessibility in the organization. So you have to appoint an accessibility manager in your organization, or several if you have a big company. And it's in the RACI, I don't know if you know the process, the RACI, you have the responsible, the person who is doing the job, and you have, it's often a different person, the person who is accountable for this job. And that's the main problem. I can give you an example. I worked in my previous company for the government, French government, and we make a charter to make a label. It's a logo, e-accessible, to make it accessible. And one of the key points you have to respect is to have a letter from the manager who say, we're involved to make it accessible. And that's the most complicated to obtain. So they want to pay to make it accessible, to make audits, but they don't want to be involved in the process. And that's really something, if you don't have in-source the problem, you can't have accessibility in the long run for your products. And it's a big issue in open source and free software community, because we always say, if it doesn't fit your needs, you just have to fork it. So that's a good way of telling people it's not my problem. So, and I work a lot with free software communities, and that's a big problem. They just say, that's not my problem. It's free. You just have to fork it and make it accessible. It's impossible to make the world accessible. You're responsible of what you're producing. Concretely, you have 3 steps in the accessibility process. The first is to make a diagnostic to know if you're accessible or not, because sometimes when they say, is it accessible? Some people answer yes or no, but they have no idea for real. So you have to check it seriously and to make an audit and to see if you're compliant or not with the, usually we use the international standard, it's WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, that you can use for free software too. Then you have to repair. The problem is, what do you repair? Everything is red. Everything, you have a lot of non-compliant points. Where do you start? But you have to make reparation. And then, because you probably didn't repair everything, you have to improve. So it's continuing enhancement. Because digital accessibility is a never-ending process. It's a process, of course. The major importance of non-regression testing for accessibility, I won't say it enough, because sometimes we have big projects. I can say Firefox, talk about Firefox, and sometimes it's really good, and you have a new version, and it doesn't work anymore for some people. And we just ask why? Because they didn't have checked this new functionality, for example, and doesn't work anymore. It's a really big problem, and it's a big responsibility. And it's really hard. I know it's hard, because it's a never-ending process. I don't know if you, in the room, you know about Exerciser? Some of you? Not a lot, but some. Exerciser is one of the tools that can help free software developers to check if it's accessible or not. For software, not for web. And what's the difference between compliance and accessibility? When we read the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and only experts do, because it's if you want to have a headache, you can try, but it's not recommended. The WCAG definition is accessibility support. It means it's supported by user-assistive technology as well as the accessibility feature in browsers and other user agents. It means you don't have to build an assistive technology. You just have to make it work with the technology the user with disability use. That's really important because it's not that complicated. Sometimes I see developers that try to add specific functionality. It's not the good way to do it. You can just think about the 3D glasses. It's the same. If you have 3D glasses to watch a movie and the movie isn't compatible with the glasses, it doesn't work. So some people have assistive technologies, but your content doesn't fit, the accessibility is not supported by your content. You have four main principles in accessibility. Your content have to be perceivable, we say POR, perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. The fourth one is really important. It's one of the four principles of accessibility defined by the WCAG, and it means your code has to respect standards. Accessibility non-compliance should be considered as a bug. That's really easy to understand. It means you have a notion in the CRPD, it's the Convention relative on person with disabilities. A bug for one person must be considered as a bug for everyone. It's not the question how many users use it. You don't know if people with disability don't use your product because it's not accessible, or because it's not accessible, or if it's accessible, maybe you would have more disabled people who would use your product. Know the product and adopt user viewpoints. You have to identify showstoppers. What is the most important in your product? Because you can't say just accessibility criterion is more important than ever. It really depends on the context. So you have compliance with a standard, like guidelines, like WCAG, and you have accessibility. Accessibility means people can use your product. And sometimes you can have an average of complaints that's not perfect, but it's usable. And sometimes you can have a good average of complaints, and it's not usable. It really depends on the context. And you can't just think about it with complaints in mind. You have to keep users in mind. And for that, we can just see that the question is inclusion. We often talk about accessibility. Accessibility is the technical part of inclusion. Inclusion is most important. It's a human right. And when we see the definition of the Convention of People with Disabilities, of the United Nations, they define discrimination on the basis of disability includes denial of reasonable accommodation. So you have a responsibility, you're accountable of what your product. And what is reasonable accommodation? Reasonable accommodation means necessary and appropriate modification adjustments, not imposing a disproportionate or undue burden, were needed in a particular case to ensure to persons with disabilities the enjoyment or exercise on an equal basis with others. So it's important. If you consider a feature is not that important, you don't have to put it on your site or your software. If it's important for some people, it's important for everybody. Of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. So we have two axes to make prioritization. You can prioritize with the user impact. Is it necessary and appropriate? And the costs count too. You don't have to impose a disproportionate or undue burden. So it means, in the legal term, it doesn't mean you have to be 100% compliant. You have to make it accessible to the most people, and they have to be able to use your product. So we can define 4 priority fields in digital accessibility. Depends on user impact and cost. The first one is when you have user impact is really high and the cost is really low. Of course, you have to start with that. It's the first priority. So it's quite easy to understand. The fourth priority is easy to understand too. It's really expensive and it's not really useful. So in this case, you just have to think, is it really useful, this functionality, this feature, if it's not useful for some people? Sometimes it is. Sometimes you have some features that are really visual and give some feelings for the user, but people with visual impairments won't benefit for it. So maybe it's not really useful for some user and useful for others and really expensive to make it accessible. So you can think about that. And then I think the first case and the last case can have a consensus. Then you have to prioritize between the 2 and the 3, and it can be more bring more discussion. I think in second time you have to make reparation in the non-compliance when it's really easy to correct. Even if the user impact is not the most important, because it makes it makes your developer in good mood. They can just close a lot of issues, and it's really important for them. And it makes the code cleaner. So you have the fourth principle, robust. So it contributes to make the code more robust. And the last one is the priority 3. The priority 3, it's a case when you can derogate to the universal design principle. It means you can just decide to not correct, to not repair the non-compliance, but you have to give an alternative. We can cite the Wikipedia example. When you want to create an account on Wikipedia, you have a link and you fulfill a form, and then you have a CAPTCHA. But if you're not able to solve this CAPTCHA, you can just send an email and they help you. That's an alternative that works because you're able to create your account. And that's really not compliant, but that's accessible, and that's really inclusion. So you have a range of solution possibilities. So in conclusion, you have 3 key points. Insource digital accessibility as one of your organization process. You can't outsource it. It doesn't work in the long run. Check small, check often, and never stop. It has to be in your process to include the accessibility audit to really know precisely what is compliant or not. And identify the core functionality of your products on the user side, make them work for all. So adopt your user side, not only it works because it's standard, but does it work for your user? So it's just the last word. It's okay if you try and fail, but it's not okay if you fail to try. Thank you.